The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees, and across the settlement, families huddled around dying fires as their firewood supplies dwindled to nothing. But inside Mikkel Strand's cabin, built on what everyone called cursed black sand, the air remained warm enough that he wore only a single wool shirt while his neighbors froze. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1848 arrived early in the Northern Territories, sweeping down from the Arctic with a brutality that caught even experienced settlers unprepared. By late October, temperatures that normally held until December had already descended on the scattered homesteads along the Kobuk River in what would later become northern Alaska. The Russian-American company maintained a distant trading post, but the handful of families who had pushed into this region were functionally isolated, connected only by trap lines and the occasional winter visit between neighbors whose cabins might be separated by 5 or 10 miles of frozen wilderness. Mikkel Strand had arrived in the territory 3 years earlier, part of a small group of Norwegian and Danish settlers, drawn by rumors of rich fur trapping and the promise of land that would never be crowded. He was 32 years old when he made the journey, accompanied by his wife Anna, who was 28, and their daughter Ingrid, who was 6. They had left a cramped existence in coastal Norway, where fishing rights were controlled by wealthy families and land ownership was impossible for common people. The promise of the North, despite its harshness, represented freedom. Mikkel was a capable man by the standards of frontier life. He could build adequate shelter, trap efficiently, hunt when necessary, and had the physical endurance required for survival in extreme conditions. He was not exceptional, not one of the legendary mountainmen whose exploits would fill books, but he was competent and careful. Those qualities had kept his family alive through their first 3 winters, which was more than some could claim. 2 families who had arrived the same year had already retreated south, unable to cope with the isolation and cold. The settlement, if it could be called that, consisted of 11 families spread across a region roughly 30 miles square. The landscape was a mixture of stunted spruce forest, tundra, and exposed rock. In summer, it was beautiful in a stark way, with endless daylight and wildflowers covering the brief growing season. In winter, it was a monochrome world of white snow, black trees, and gray sky. The sun appeared for only a few hours each day by December, rising sluggishly above the southern horizon before sliding back down. Firewood was the currency of survival. Every settler knew this. From September through March, staying warm meant burning wood constantly. A typical cabin required approximately 4 cords of wood per month during the coldest periods. That meant cutting, hauling, and stacking enormous quantities during the brief summer and fall. Men spent weeks at this labor, working until their hands bled and their backs screamed. It was never enough. Every winter brought anxiety about whether supplies would last until spring thaw. Mikkel's cabin was typical of the region. Logs chinked with moss and mud, a sod roof, 1 small window covered with scraped caribou hide, and a door made from split planks. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, drawing smoke through a crude chimney. The family slept on a platform raised off the frozen ground, insulated with layers of caribou hide and whatever fabric they could spare. When the fire burned hot, the interior was bearable. When it died down, frost formed on the interior walls. The crisis came on January 12, 1849. A storm system moved in from the northwest, bringing winds that screamed across the tundra and temperatures that plunged to levels Mikkel had never experienced. The thermometer he kept outside registered -42 degrees on the morning of January 13th. Inside the cabin, despite burning wood constantly, the temperature hovered barely above freezing. Anna had been sick for 3 days before the storm hit. What started as a persistent cough had developed into something more serious. She had difficulty breathing, complained of chest pain, and developed a fever that left her shaking under every blanket they owned. Mikkel knew she needed warmth more than anything, but his firewood supply was running dangerously low. He had miscalculated during the fall, losing 2 weeks of cutting time to an early injury when a falling branch had broken his left hand. Those 2 weeks now meant the difference between adequate supply and potential disaster. He burned wood as fast as he dared, trying to keep the cabin warm enough for Anna to recover. Ingrid huddled beside her mother, frightened by the rattling breathing and her father's obvious worry. On January 14th, Mikkel made the decision to use wood faster than was sustainable. Anna's breathing had become labored, her fever spiking higher. He fed the fire constantly, keeping the cabin warmer than at any point that winter. For 2 days, this continued. The woodpile shrank visibly. On January 16th, Anna seemed slightly better. Her breathing eased somewhat, the fever dropped. Mikkel allowed himself to hope. But that evening, the temperature outside dropped even further. His thermometer could not register below -50, and the mercury had disappeared into the bulb. The cold was absolute, overwhelming, incomprehensible to anyone who had not experienced it. By January 18th, Mikkel faced an impossible choice. He had perhaps 4 days of firewood remaining, maybe 5 if he rationed carefully. But rationing meant letting the cabin temperature drop, which meant Anna's condition would worsen. He chose to keep burning at the current rate, hoping the extreme cold would break before his supply ran out. It was a gamble based on desperation rather than reason. Anna died on January 20th. The cold snap had not broken. The cabin temperature, despite Mikkel's best efforts, had dropped steadily as he tried to stretch the remaining wood. Her weakened body could not fight both the illness and the relentless cold. She died quietly in the early morning hours, with Ingrid sleeping beside her and Mikkel feeding the last substantial logs into the fireplace. Mikkel stood beside her body as dawn broke, such as it was in the Arctic January. He had 3 days of wood remaining, maybe 4. The cold continued unabated. His daughter slept, unaware yet that her mother was gone. And Mikkel understood with perfect clarity that he had failed at the most fundamental task of frontier survival. He had not prepared adequately for winter. That failure had killed his wife. The knowledge settled into him like the cold itself, permanent and absolute. Mikkel buried Anna on January 23rd in ground he had to thaw with fire before he could dig. The cold snap finally broke on January 25th, temperatures rising to a nearly pleasant -10 degrees. A neighbor, Lars Johansson, visited on January 28th and helped Mikkel cut emergency firewood from standing dead trees near the cabin. Lars offered to take Ingrid to his own cabin until Mikkel could recover himself, but Mikkel refused. She was all he had remaining. The rest of that winter passed in a gray blur of survival. Mikkel trapped mechanically, processed pelts without thought, maintained the cabin and fire through sheer routine. Ingrid grieved in the way children do, with moments of profound sadness interrupted by periods of apparent normalcy. She was too young to understand permanence, young enough that memories of her mother would fade into impressions rather than clear recollections. Spring came late that year, arriving fully only in mid-May. As the snow melted and the sun began its long arc across the sky, staying up 18 and then 20 hours per day, Mikkel found himself unable to stop thinking about heat, specifically about how to retain it, generate it, and ensure he never again faced the choice between adequate warmth and depleted fuel supplies. He began noticing things he had overlooked before. On warm June days, dark rocks scattered across the tundra became hot to the touch, while light-colored stones nearby remained cool. He could hold a pale granite stone comfortably, but dark basalt from the same area would burn his palm if left in the sun. The difference was dramatic and obvious once he paid attention. He noticed that snow melted first around dark objects. A dark log lying on white snow would be surrounded by a moat of meltwater, while snow elsewhere remained solid. Dark patches of exposed earth absorbed sunlight and stayed bare while lighter-colored areas retained snowpack longer. These observations were not new to anyone who lived in the north, but Mikkel began studying them with methodical intensity. He collected rocks of different colors and placed them in the sun, measuring how long he could hold each one before the heat became uncomfortable. Dark rocks became untouchable within an hour. Light rocks remained cool even after a full day of exposure. He placed his hand above dark rocks and felt heat radiating upward. Light rocks radiated nothing perceptible. By July, Mikkel had filled a notebook with observations about heat, light, and color. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had attended school through age 12 in Norway, could read and write adequately, and knew basic mathematics, but he had no training in physics or engineering. What he had was the ability to observe carefully and draw logical conclusions from what he saw. The question that obsessed him was simple. If dark materials absorbed and held heat from the sun so efficiently, could that heat be captured and used to warm a dwelling? Not as the primary heat source, that would be impossible during the dark winter months, but as a supplement that would reduce firewood consumption enough to matter. In early August, Mikkel made a journey he had postponed for months. He needed to visit the Russian-American company trading post to sell his winter's furs and purchase supplies for the coming year. The post was 43 miles southeast of his cabin, a journey that took 3 days on foot with a heavy pack. Ingrid stayed with Lars Johansson's family, something she had done before and accepted without complaint. The route took Mikkel through terrain he had not explored carefully. Most of his trapping occurred north and west of his cabin. The southeast direction toward the trading post crossed different geology, moving from the spruce and tundra landscape he knew into areas of exposed volcanic rock. The volcanism was ancient, millions of years dormant, but the evidence remained in the form of basalt formations and scattered deposits of volcanic material. On the second day of travel, Mikkel crossed a broad plain covered in black sand. The deposit was extensive, perhaps half a mile across, a striking contrast to the surrounding landscape. The sand was fine-grained, almost like dark beach sand, but unmistakably volcanic in origin. He had seen the area before on previous trips, but had never paid particular attention. Now, with heat and thermal absorption occupying his thoughts constantly, he stopped to investigate. The temperature that day was perhaps 65 degrees, warm by northern standards. The black sand, exposed to the August sun, was scorching. Mikkel removed his boot and stepped on it barefoot. He pulled back immediately. The sand was far hotter than the air temperature, hot enough to be painful. He placed his hand an inch above the surface and felt intense, radiant heat. This was not the mild warmth of dark rocks heating in the sun. This was concentrated thermal energy on a scale he had not encountered before. He knelt and dug into the sand. 6 inches down, it was still noticeably warm. A foot down, it retained heat above the ambient ground temperature. The entire deposit was functioning as a massive heat sink, absorbing solar energy and storing it in its dark, dense mass. Mikkel spent an hour conducting simple experiments. He buried his hand at different depths, feeling how the temperature changed. He compared the black sand to adjacent areas of lighter soil. The difference was remarkable. That evening, he camped at the edge of the volcanic sand deposit rather than continuing toward the trading post. As the sun set and air temperature dropped into the 40s, the black sand remained warm. He could feel heat radiating from it even in the growing darkness. He lay down on the sand, using only a thin blanket, and found the ground beneath him far warmer than sleeping on normal earth would have been. By morning, the sand had cooled significantly, but remained warmer than the surrounding terrain. As soon as the sun rose, the heating process began again. Mikkel watched carefully, noting how quickly the temperature climbed. Within 2 hours of sunrise, the sand was already warm to the touch. By midday, it was again too hot for bare skin contact. The implications were obvious. If black volcanic sand absorbed and stored heat this efficiently during the brief Arctic summer, it would continue doing so, albeit at reduced levels, during winter. Even the weak winter sun, barely clearing the horizon for a few hours each day, would heat this dark surface far more than it would heat snow, light soil, or any other typical ground covering. Mikkel arrived at the trading post on August 10th and completed his business efficiently. His furs brought a fair price, enough to purchase the supplies he needed for the coming year. but his mind remained fixed on the black sand deposit he had discovered. Before leaving the post, he spoke with the factor, a Russian named Dmitry Volkov, about the volcanic sand plains. Volkov confirmed what Mikkel had observed. The deposits were extensive in several locations within 50 miles of the post. They were geologically ancient, remnants of volcanic activity that had occurred long before human habitation. The native Inupiaq people avoided building near them, considering the black sand unlucky. Some trappers had reported that snow melted faster in those areas, but no one had attempted to use the deposits for any practical purpose. Mikkel returned to his cabin on August 14th and immediately began planning. His current cabin was adequate, but not ideal. It sat in a location he had chosen 3 years earlier, based primarily on proximity to a reliable creek and decent trapping territory. The location had no particular advantage regarding solar exposure or thermal management. If he was going to test his theory about using black sand as a heat source, he would need to build a new cabin in a location where volcanic sand was either present or could be transported feasibly. On August 20th, Mikkel made his proposal to Lars Johansen during an evening visit. He explained his observations about heat absorption, described the volcanic sand deposit, and outlined his plan to build a new cabin on or near black sand, possibly even spreading sand around the structure deliberately to create a heat-absorbing foundation. Lars listened politely, then laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement at what he considered an eccentric idea. He pointed out that Mikkel's current cabin was perfectly functional. Building a new structure would consume months of labor that could be better spent cutting firewood, trapping, or improving existing infrastructure. The idea that black sand could meaningfully heat a cabin seemed far-fetched. Yes, dark surfaces got warm in the sun, but that warmth dissipated quickly. It could not possibly substitute for real firewood in a proper fireplace. Mikkel tried to explain the concept of thermal mass, heat storage, and radiant energy transfer. He used simple terms, describing how the black sand stayed warm even after sunset, how heat penetrated deep into the deposit, how the dark color absorbed far more solar energy than snow or light-colored ground. Lars remained skeptical but not hostile. He suggested Mikkel focus on more practical concerns, like ensuring he cut enough firewood to avoid a repeat of last winter's tragedy. Over the following weeks, Mikkel mentioned his plan to other neighbors. The response was universally dismissive. Olaf Henriksen, whose cabin was 7 miles northeast, called it black sand nonsense. Bjorn Svensson suggested Mikkel's grief had affected his judgment. Kari Anderson, one of the few women homesteaders, listened sympathetically but clearly thought the idea impractical. The nickname emerged in early September. Someone, probably Olaf, began referring to Mikkel as Black Sand Mikkel in conversation with others. The name spread quickly through the small community. It was not said with particular malice, but with the gentle mockery communities reserved for eccentrics who pursue strange ideas. Mikkel heard the nickname and did not argue against it. He understood he was proposing something unconventional. The skepticism was predictable and, from their perspective, reasonable. Mikkel selected his new cabin site on September 3rd. The location was 3 miles southwest of his current cabin, closer to the volcanic sand deposits he had discovered, though still 8 miles from the largest concentration of black sand. The site sat on a slight rise with excellent southern exposure, crucial for maximizing solar heating during the low winter sun. A small creek ran 200 yards to the east, far enough to require carrying water, but close enough to remain practical. The ground at the site was typical tundra, a mixture of thin soil, moss, and permafrost, starting 18 inches below the surface. Mikkel's plan required removing the organic layer and creating a foundation of black volcanic sand approximately 30 feet by 30 feet, extending 10 feet beyond his planned cabin walls on all sides. The cabin itself would sit centered on this black sand platform. Transporting the sand presented immediate challenges. The nearest significant deposit was 8 miles away. Mikkel had no horse or ox for hauling. He owned a hand-pulled travois, a simple sled-like device useful for moving loads across relatively flat terrain. His plan was to load the travois with sacks of sand, haul it to the cabin site, and repeat the process as many times as necessary. He began on September 5th. Each load consisted of 4 large sacks, approximately 200 pounds total. The journey to the sand deposit took 3 hours at a steady walking pace. Loading the sacks required an hour. The return journey, pulling the loaded travois, took 5 hours. Unloading and spreading the sand took another hour. Each round trip consumed 10 hours of hard physical labor and delivered 800 pounds of sand. Mikkel calculated he needed approximately 40,000 pounds of black sand to create a layer 12 inches deep across his 30 by 30 foot foundation area. That meant 50 trips, minimum. Working from dawn until dark, he could complete 1 trip per day. 50 trips meant 50 days of labor, not accounting for weather delays or necessary rest days. Other settlers who traveled past the volcanic sand deposit observed Mikkel loading his travois. Word spread quickly. Black Sand Mikkel was actually doing it, actually hauling tons of worthless volcanic sand across 8 miles of wilderness to build some kind of experimental cabin. The mockery intensified. Olaf Henriksen rode past one day and shouted that Mikkel should be cutting firewood instead of hauling dirt like a madman. Bjorn Svensson visited in late September and directly confronted Mikkel, arguing that the entire project was foolish and dangerous. Winter was approaching. Mikkel had not yet cut adequate firewood for his current cabin, let alone prepared for a new one. Mikkel listened to these criticisms without arguing. He understood their perspective. From any conventional viewpoint, his project was irrational. He was investing enormous labor into an unproven theory while neglecting established survival priorities. But Anna's death had changed something fundamental in how he thought about risk. The conventional approach, doing what everyone else did, had failed to keep his wife alive. If he was going to survive future winters, if he was going to keep Ingrid safe, he needed something better than conventional methods. By October 1st, Mikkel had completed 32 trips. The black sand foundation was taking shape, a dark rectangular patch contrasting sharply with the surrounding tundra. The first snow fell on October 8th, light flurries that melted by afternoon. Mikkel accelerated his hauling schedule, working 14-hour days despite the growing cold and darkness. By October 18th, he had completed 47 trips. The foundation was nearly complete, a 12-inch deep layer of black volcanic sand spread across the entire building site. Even in the weak October sunlight, the sand absorbed noticeably more heat than surrounding ground. Snow that fell on the black surface melted within hours, while snow on adjacent areas remained. On October 20th, Mikkel began cutting logs for the cabin walls. He selected spruce trees from a stand 2 miles north, choosing specimens approximately 10 inches in diameter with minimal taper. Each tree required an hour to fell, limb, and section into appropriate lengths. He hauled logs using the same travois he had used for sand, though the weight and awkwardness made the work more difficult. The cabin design reflected specific thermal principles. Most settlers built directly on the ground or on simple log foundations. Mikkel constructed a different system. He placed large flat stones around the perimeter of his black sand foundation, creating a raised platform 8 inches above the sand surface. Across these stones, he laid floor joists cut from straight spruce logs. The floor itself consisted of split planks fitted tightly together. This created an air gap between the cabin floor and the black sand beneath. The reasoning was thermal management. The black sand, heated by sunlight, would radiate warmth upward. The air gap beneath the floor would fill with this warm air, heated further by direct radiation from the sand surface. The wooden floor would absorb this heat and transmit it into the cabin interior. The system created a passive heating mechanism that required no fuel, no maintenance, no effort beyond the initial construction. The wall construction was conventional log cabin technique. Mikkel used saddle notches at the corners, fitted the logs carefully, and chinked the gaps with moss and clay. The walls went up quickly. By November 3rd, All four walls stood complete to their full height of 7 feet. The roof followed standard practice with ridgepoles, split planks, birch bark, and sod covering everything. Mikkel included a stone fireplace and chimney on the north wall. The door was solid, built from heavy planks, and hung on iron hinges. The single window faced south, positioned to capture maximum sunlight, covered with caribou hide scraped thin. By November 15th, the cabin was complete enough to occupy. Mikkel moved his possessions and Ingrid from the old cabin to the new structure. The black sand perimeter extended 10 feet beyond the cabin walls on all sides. This outer ring would absorb solar energy and radiate heat toward the cabin walls, remain snow-free longer than surrounding ground, and provide visual evidence of whether the thermal absorption system was working as Mikkel theorized. Understanding why Mikkel's system would work requires examining the physics of solar radiation, thermal absorption, and heat transfer. These principles were not formally understood by most frontier settlers, but they operated according to unchanging natural laws, regardless of human comprehension. Mikkel had observed effects and drawn correct conclusions about causes, even if he lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe what was happening. Solar radiation reaches Earth across vast distances of space, traveling as electromagnetic waves. When this radiation strikes a surface, 3 things can occur: reflection, transmission, or absorption. Light-colored surfaces reflect most radiation, sending it back into the atmosphere. Transparent materials transmit radiation, allowing it to pass through. Dark surfaces absorb radiation, converting the electromagnetic energy into thermal energy, which humans perceive as heat. The relationship between color and absorption is direct. A perfectly black surface absorbs approximately 95% of incoming solar radiation. A perfectly white surface reflects approximately 95%. Real-world materials fall somewhere between these extremes. Snow, being very light-colored, reflects 70 to 90% of solar radiation depending on its condition. Fresh, clean snow reflects more than old, dirty snow. Light-colored soil reflects 50 to 70%. Dark volcanic sand absorbs 85 to 90%, approaching the theoretical maximum for natural materials. Mikkel's black sand foundation functioned as a massive solar collector. During daylight hours, even the weak Arctic winter sun delivered energy to the sand surface. The dark color ensured maximum absorption. The sand's physical properties determined what happened next. Volcanic sand, composed primarily of basalt particles, has high specific heat capacity. This technical term means it requires significant energy to raise the temperature of a given mass. But conversely, it releases that energy slowly when cooling. A material with low specific heat capacity, like metal, heats quickly but also cools quickly. Touch a dark metal surface in sunlight and it feels burning hot, but remove it from the sun and it cools to air temperature within minutes. Volcanic sand behaves differently. It heats more slowly than metal, but once heated, it retains that warmth for hours. The sand in Mikkel's foundation absorbed solar energy throughout the daylight hours, storing it in the thermal mass of thousands of pounds of material. Heat moves through materials and across spaces through 3 mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is direct transfer through physical contact. The heated sand conducted thermal energy downward into deeper layers and outward into adjacent sand. Convection is transfer through moving fluids, either liquid or gas. The air gap beneath Mikkel's cabin floor allowed convection currents to form. Warm air, heated by contact with the sand surface, rose through the gap, transferring heat to the wooden floor above. Radiation is electromagnetic energy transfer, similar to solar radiation but in the infrared spectrum. The hot sand radiated infrared energy upward, absorbed by the cabin floor and air gap. The combined effect created a passive heating system. During daylight hours, solar energy entered the black sand continuously. This energy converted to heat, which distributed through conduction into the sand mass, through convection into the air gap, and through radiation upward toward the cabin floor. The process continued even after sunset because the stored thermal energy in the sand mass released slowly over many hours. By late November, Mikkel had completed every aspect of the cabin that could be finished before heavy snow arrived. The structure was solid, weathertight, and positioned precisely to maximize interaction with the black sand foundation. He had cut enough firewood to supply the cabin through winter, learning from the previous year's catastrophic miscalculation. 20 cords of spruce and birch sat stacked near the door, covered with bark to shed moisture. The settlement's opinion of his project remained skeptical. Most neighbors had seen the completed cabin during courtesy visits that served as the social connection in such isolated communities. They acknowledged the construction was competent. The logs fit well, the chinking looked adequate, the fireplace drew smoke properly. But the black sand foundation struck them as an elaborate eccentricity at best, dangerous foolishness at worst. Olaf Henriksen stated his opinion directly during a November visit. The black sand was unnecessary decoration. It would make no meaningful difference in cabin temperature. Mikkel would realize this once winter truly arrived, and he would regret the hundreds of hours spent hauling sand when he should have been cutting additional firewood or improving his trap lines. The cabin itself was fine, Olaf acknowledged, but it was fine despite the black sand, not because of it. Bjorn Svensson brought his 2 teenage sons to visit on November 23rd. The boys were curious about the unusual construction. Bjorn explained to them, in Mikkel's presence, that sometimes grief made men do strange things. Mikkel had lost his wife to the cold and now believed black sand would somehow prevent future tragedy. It was understandable as an emotional response, but it was not rational. The boys should learn from this example to base their decisions on proven methods rather than experimental theories. Carrie Anderson was more diplomatic. She visited on November 28th with her daughter, bringing smoked salmon as a gift. She walked around the cabin's perimeter, examining the black sand that extended beyond the walls. She asked intelligent questions about Mikkel's theory, listened to his explanations, and did not openly mock the effort. But her final comment was telling. She hoped the cabin served him well and suggested that if the black sand proved ineffective, at least the cabin itself was well built enough to keep him and Ingrid safe through conventional means. Even Lars Johansson expressed doubts. He visited on December 2nd and sat in the cabin as evening fell. The interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, though Mikkel had a modest fire burning. Lars attributed the warmth entirely to the fire and to good construction. He told Mikkel the cabin was excellent work, but suggested the black sand was probably doing nothing more than providing a stable, well-drained foundation. The nickname Black Sand Mikkel had become permanent. Children in the settlement used it without understanding its mocking origin. Adults used it casually in conversation. Mikkel accepted it without protest. Names carried less weight than results, and results would become apparent soon enough. Ingrid had adapted to the new cabin quickly. At 7 years old, she retained few specific memories of her mother. The new cabin was warmer than the old one. She liked that snow melted quickly around their home, creating a dark perimeter that made the cabin easy to find, even in heavy snowfall. December arrived with temperatures dropping steadily. The first significant cold arrived on December 9th. Temperature dropped to -20 degrees overnight, rising only to -12 during the brief daylight hours. Across the settlement, families increased their firewood consumption, keeping fires burning constantly to maintain livable interior temperatures. The Arctic winter had begun in earnest. Inside Mikkel's cabin, the temperature remained comfortable. He maintained a modest fire in the fireplace, burning perhaps half the wood he would have needed in his previous cabin. The difference was noticeable and measurable. He had constructed a simple thermometer using a sealed glass tube partially filled with colored alcohol. Inside the cabin, the temperature held steady around 55 degrees. Outside, -12. The 20-foot perimeter of black sand around the cabin remained completely snow-free despite 2 inches of accumulation on surrounding ground. Mikkel conducted careful observations. Each morning at dawn, He checked the black sand surface temperature by placing his bare hand on it for several seconds. Even after a night of -20-degree air temperature, the sand felt noticeably warm, not hot as it would be in summer, but distinctly above freezing. He dug into the sand with a wooden rod, checking temperature at different depths. 6 inches down, the sand was warmer than at the surface. 12 inches down, warmer still. The physics were working exactly as he had theorized. During the brief daylight hours, approximately 4 hours of weak sunlight between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, the black sand absorbed solar radiation despite the low angle and limited intensity. The dark surface captured energy that snow would have reflected. This absorbed energy converted to heat, which conducted downward into the sand mass and radiated upward toward the cabin. The stored thermal energy in thousands of pounds of sand released slowly overnight. The sand functioned as a massive heat battery, charged daily by the sun and discharged gradually through the long Arctic nights. The air gap beneath the cabin floor allowed this heat to rise through convection. Warm air, lighter than cold air, flowed upward through the 8-inch gap, transferring energy to the wooden floor above. The floor absorbed this heat and radiated it into the cabin interior. By December 15th, the cold had intensified to -28 degrees. Mikkel's firewood consumption remained remarkably low. He burned approximately 1/3 the wood that conventional cabins required. The black sand perimeter stayed snow-free, creating a dark moat around the structure. Snow that fell on the sand melted within hours, even in negative temperatures, evidence of the continuous heat radiation from the dark surface. Lars Johansen visited on December 17th and noticed the snow-free perimeter immediately. He commented on it, acknowledging the effect was dramatic. But he attributed it to heat escaping from the cabin rather than solar absorption by the sand. The cabin must be poorly insulated, he suggested, allowing interior warmth to leak out and melt surrounding snow. This was actually wasteful rather than beneficial, indicating Mikkel should improve his chinking. Mikkel did not argue. He simply invited Lars inside to feel the comfortable temperature and observe the modest fire burning. Lars acknowledged the interior was warm, but remained convinced the black sand played no significant role. Good construction and adequate firewood were the only factors that mattered. January brought the darkest period of the Arctic winter. The sun barely cleared the southern horizon, appearing for less than 3 hours daily. Temperatures remained below -20 consistently, occasionally dropping below -40 during clear nights, when heat radiated from the Earth's surface into space without cloud cover to reflect it back. These were the conditions that tested every aspect of frontier survival. Mikkel maintained his observation routine with scientific precision. Each day at noon, he measured the black sand surface temperature using a calibrated method. He had embedded several metal rods at different depths in the sand. By touching these rods, which conducted temperature from their buried ends to the exposed surface, he could estimate subsurface temperatures. Even during the coldest periods, the sand 6 inches below the surface remained above freezing. This was remarkable because the surrounding ground was frozen solid. Permafrost in the region extended hundreds of feet deep, and seasonal freezing penetrated 18 to 24 inches below the surface in normal ground. But the black sand, continuously absorbing whatever limited solar radiation reached it, maintained temperatures that prevented deep freezing. The thermal mass effect meant heat absorbed during even brief sunny periods persisted for days, never allowing the sand to reach equilibrium with the extreme air temperatures. The cabin's heating efficiency became increasingly apparent. On January 8th, when air temperature reached -37 degrees, Mikkel conducted a careful measurement. He let his fireplace fire die down to coals overnight. By morning, with no active fire and outside temperature at -35, the cabin interior measured 42 degrees. This was cold enough to be uncomfortable, but far above freezing and survivable with adequate clothing and blankets. He rekindled the fire, and within 2 hours, interior temperature reached 55 degrees, with a moderate fire consuming perhaps 1 log per hour. In his previous cabin under similar conditions, maintaining 55 degrees would have required a roaring fire consuming 3 to 4 logs per hour. The difference represented approximately 75% reduction in firewood consumption, or alternatively, a 75% increase in the amount of time his wood supply would last. Mikkel documented these observations in a notebook, recording daily temperatures, firewood consumption, and snow melt patterns around the cabin. He was not literate enough to write formal scientific reports, but his records were careful and consistent. He noted that snow melt around the cabin perimeter was most dramatic on sunny days, but occurred even during overcast periods when only diffuse light reached the ground. The black sand absorbed energy across a broader spectrum than he had initially understood. By mid-January, the snow-free perimeter had widened. Heat radiating from the sand melted snow not just directly on the black surface, but several feet beyond it. The cabin sat in the center of a circular clearing, approximately 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by snow-covered landscape. The visual effect was striking, a dark island in a white ocean. Ingrid noticed animals visiting the perimeter. Ravens, Arctic foxes, and occasional caribou approached the warm ground, apparently seeking relief from the relentless cold. The black sand provided a microclimate where temperatures were measurably higher than surrounding areas. This unintended benefit meant Mikkel could observe wildlife closely, and the frequent animal visits provided assurance that predators were less likely to approach unnoticed. The catastrophic cold arrived on January 24th. A high-pressure system settled over the region, bringing cloudless skies and temperatures that plunged beyond anything recorded in the settlement's brief history. Mikkel's alcohol thermometer registered negative 48 degrees on January 25th. By January 26th, the alcohol had contracted so far that measurement became impossible. He estimated negative 55 degrees based on the behavior of water and other indicators. This was cold that killed. Exposed skin froze in less than 60 seconds. Breath crystallized instantly into ice fog. Metal became brittle. Leather cracked. Wooden structures contracted, creating gaps in previously tight construction. Rivers and creeks that flowed all winter froze solid. The cold was not just uncomfortable or dangerous. It was an absolute threat to survival that tested every aspect of human preparation and infrastructure. Across the settlement, families burned firewood at desperate rates. The cold penetrated cabin walls despite chinking and insulation. Interior temperatures that normally held at 50 degrees dropped to 30 or even lower. Children huddled in bed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Adults fed fires constantly, burning wood faster than sustainable. The calculation was simple: freeze now or run out of wood later. Most chose to burn what they needed and hope the extreme cold broke before supplies exhausted. Olaf Henriksen's family burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days. On January 27th, Olaf made the decision to evacuate. He loaded his wife and 3 children onto a sled and traveled south toward the trading post, hoping to find shelter in the more established community there. The journey was extremely dangerous in such cold, but remaining in a cabin with depleting fuel was worse. They made the trip successfully, but would not return to their homestead until March. Bjorn Svensson's situation became critical on January 28th. His firewood supply, which should have lasted until March, was depleting at a rate that suggested he would run out by mid-February. He sent his oldest son to visit neighboring families, asking to borrow or purchase additional wood. Most families refused, needing every log for their own survival. Lars Johansson provided 2 days' worth of wood, all he could spare without threatening his own family's safety. Kari Anderson, living alone with her daughter after her husband's death 2 years prior, faced perhaps the worst situation. She had cut adequate wood by normal standards, but the extreme cold doubled and then tripled her consumption rate. By January 29th, she was burning her furniture to supplement the dwindling wood pile. She broke apart chairs, then a table, then the frame of a spare bed, feeding them into the fire to maintain barely adequate heat. Inside Mikkel's cabin, the situation was dramatically different. The extreme cold had affected his black sand system, reducing its efficiency. The sand surface temperature dropped below freezing for the first time all winter. But below the surface, thermal mass effects persisted. 6 inches down, the sand remained above freezing. 12 inches down, it held at temperatures near 40 degrees. This stored heat continued radiating upward, though at reduced levels. Mikkel maintained interior cabin temperature at 50 degrees throughout the crisis. He burned firewood at a rate approximately half what other settlers required, perhaps 1.5 cords per week, compared to the 3 cords others consumed. The black sand foundation, despite the unprecedented cold, continued providing supplemental heat that made the critical difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold. The physical mechanisms remained unchanged by the extreme temperature. Solar radiation, though limited to less than 3 hours daily, still reached the black sand surface. The dark color absorbed this energy with the same efficiency it showed in warmer periods. The sand's thermal mass stored absorbed energy and released it gradually. The air gap beneath the cabin floor facilitated convection, moving warm air upward. Radiation transferred infrared energy from the sand to the wooden floor above. What changed was the magnitude of heat loss. At -55 degrees, the temperature differential between cabin interior and outside air was more than 100 degrees. Heat escaped through every imperfection in construction, every gap in chinking, every square inch of wall and roof surface. Maintaining comfortable temperature required either massive fuel input to replace escaped heat or extraordinary insulation to prevent heat loss. Mikkel's cabin had good but not exceptional insulation. The black sand foundation provided the supplemental input that compensated. On January 30th, Mikkel conducted measurements during the coldest part of the crisis. Outside air temperature was -53 degrees based on his estimate. The black sand surface in shadow before noon measured 28 degrees, 6 inches below the surface, 34 degrees, 12 inches below, 40 degrees. The cabin floor, positioned 8 inches above the sand with an air gap between, measured 46 degrees on its underside and 52 degrees on top. Interior air temperature held at 50 degrees with a moderate fire burning. The snow-free perimeter had shrunk dramatically. Extreme cold overwhelmed the sand's heat radiation for the first time. Snow accumulated on portions of the black sand that received no direct sunlight. But the 20-foot circle immediately surrounding the cabin remained bare. Heat radiating from the sand directly beneath and adjacent to the structure was sufficient to prevent snow accumulation even in -50-degree temperatures. Ingrid remained comfortable throughout the crisis. She wore wool clothing indoors and slept under caribou hide blankets, but she was never cold enough to be in danger. Mikkel maintained the fire carefully, burning dried spruce that produced steady heat without excessive smoke. He had calculated his firewood supply before the cold snap began. At current consumption rates, he had enough wood to last until late April, well beyond any realistic extension of winter conditions. The extreme cold persisted through February 2nd. 5 days of temperatures that never rose above -40, with nighttime lows estimated at -55 or below. This was cold that entered frontier legend, the winter that drove families from the territory and convinced others never to attempt settlement in such latitudes. Mikkel and Ingrid remained in their cabin, warm and safe, burning through firewood at a sustainable rate, while the black sand beneath them absorbed meager solar radiation and released stored thermal energy accumulated over months of operation. The temperature moderated on February 3rd, rising to -28 degrees by midday. This felt almost warm after the preceding week. Across the settlement, families emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. The social fabric of such isolated communities depended on mutual support during crises. Those who had survived checked on those who might not have. Lars Johansson arrived at Mikkel's cabin on February 4th. He had traveled from his homestead 7 miles away, concerned about Mikkel and Ingrid after the unprecedented cold. Lars expected to find them struggling, possibly in need of food or firewood assistance. Instead, he found Mikkel outside in relatively light clothing, checking his trap lines in the nearby forest. Ingrid played in the cabin doorway, apparently comfortable despite temperatures still below -20. Lars noticed the snow-free perimeter immediately. Even after 5 days of extreme cold, a circular area perhaps 30 feet in diameter around the cabin remained completely bare of snow. The black sand was visible, dark against the surrounding white landscape. Snow that had accumulated during the coldest days was melting, even in -28-degree air temperature. Lars stood on the perimeter, feeling warmth radiating from the ground through his boot soles. Mikkel invited Lars inside. The interior temperature was comfortable, perhaps 55 degrees. A modest fire burned in the fireplace, nothing like the roaring blazes that had been necessary in other cabins during the crisis. Lars commented on the comfortable warmth, expecting to see evidence of heavy recent consumption. Instead, he saw a well-stocked but not depleted supply. Mikkel had clearly not burned through firewood at the desperate rates that characterized the past week elsewhere. Lars asked directly how this was possible. Mikkel led him back outside and explained the black sand system methodically. He showed Lars the foundation extending beyond the cabin walls. He described solar radiation absorption, thermal mass storage, and radiant heat transfer. He explained the air gap beneath the floor and how convection moved warm air upward. He offered to let Lars feel the temperature difference between the black sand and adjacent ground. Lars knelt and placed his bare hand on the black sand. It was noticeably warm, perhaps 35 or 40 degrees despite air temperature of -28. He moved his hand to snow-covered ground 3 feet away. That surface was frozen solid, effectively the same temperature as the air. He returned his hand to the black sand, confirming the difference was real and substantial. He stood and looked at the cabin with new understanding. The mockery that had characterized Lars's previous attitude disappeared. He asked detailed questions about construction, about how much sand Mikkel had hauled, about whether the system worked equally well in summer and winter. Mikkel answered patiently, explaining that summer provided excessive heat, while winter provided the perfect balance of solar input and heat demand. The system was optimized specifically for surviving Arctic winters, the exact condition that had killed Anna and threatened everyone else just days ago. Lars stayed for 2 hours, examining every aspect of the construction. When he finally left, he told Mikkel that he had been wrong. The black sand was not decoration or eccentricity. It was genuinely functional innovation that had just proven its worth during the most severe test imaginable. Word of Mikkel's success during the crisis cold spread rapidly through the settlement. Lars Johansson told neighbors about the warm cabin and snow-free perimeter. Bjorn Svensson visited on February 8th and saw the system firsthand. Carrie Anderson came on February 12th, desperate for any technique that might prevent future winters from threatening her and her daughter's survival. Within 2 weeks of the crisis ending, every family in the settlement had heard detailed accounts of Black Sand Mikkel's impossible cabin. The nickname persisted, but its connotation changed. What had been mockery became acknowledgement of innovation. Black Sand Mikkel now signified the man who had solved a fundamental problem that everyone else simply endured. Several families asked if they could visit to see the construction personally. Mikkel welcomed them, walking each visitor around the perimeter, explaining the physics as he understood them, describing the construction process. Bjorn Svensson was the first to commit to building a similar system. He visited on February 18th with detailed questions about sand depth, foundation dimensions, and cabin floor construction. Mikkel shared everything he knew, drawing diagrams in the snow with a stick to illustrate the air gap design and floor joist placement. Bjorn asked about the nearest volcanic sand deposits. Mikkel provided directions to 3 locations, including the extensive deposit 8 miles southeast that he had used for most of his supply. The challenge was timing. February was too cold and dark for major construction. The ground was frozen solid, making excavation impossible. But spring would arrive in April, providing a brief window for building before summer trapping season demanded attention. Families who wanted to implement black sand systems would need to work quickly and efficiently during that window. Kari Anderson asked whether the system could be retrofitted to existing cabins. Mikkel considered this carefully. Complete foundation replacement would require lifting or dismantling an existing cabin, impractical given the labor involved. But spreading black sand around an existing structure might provide partial benefit. The sand would still absorb solar radiation and radiate heat toward the cabin walls, even without the air gap system that made Mikkel's foundation so efficient. The effect would be reduced but not negligible. Lars Johansson proposed a community effort. If multiple families worked together, they could haul volcanic sand more efficiently. A group of men with multiple travaux could transport in 1 week what took Mikkel 50 days working alone. This cooperation could allow several families to build black sand systems before summer arrived. The proposal gained immediate support. On March 1st, 6 men traveled together to the volcanic sand deposit. They brought 4 travois and worked as a coordinated team, loading all 4 simultaneously and traveling together back to the settlement. In 1 day, they transported approximately 3,000 pounds of sand, more than Mikkel could move in 3 days working alone. They divided this load among 3 families who were planning new cabins. Over the following weeks, this pattern continued. Weather permitting, groups of men made trips to the sand deposit, hauling material for whoever needed it. The effort became a community project, with those not building new cabins contributing labor to help those who were. This cooperation reflected frontier pragmatism. Today's helper might be tomorrow's recipient when circumstances changed. Spring arrived in late April with dramatic suddenness. Snow melted rapidly, exposing brown tundra and awakening dormant vegetation. Temperatures rose above freezing during daylight hours, though nights remained cold. The brief construction season had begun, and 3 families initiated building projects incorporating black sand foundations. Bjorn Svensson started construction on May 3rd. His new cabin site sat 4 miles from his current location, chosen specifically for southern exposure and proximity to a volcanic sand deposit. He excavated the organic layer across a 25-foot square area and began spreading black sand with help from his 2 sons. The foundation required approximately 30,000 pounds of material, hauled over 3 weeks through combined family and community effort. Kari Anderson took a different approach. Rather than build a new cabin, she spread black sand around her existing structure. Working with assistance from Lars Johansson and his oldest son, she created a perimeter extending 15 feet from her cabin walls. The project required less sand than a full foundation, but still represented significant labor. By May 20th, her cabin sat surrounded by a dark apron of volcanic material. The 3rd family, recent arrivals named Henrik and Solveig Larsen, built their first permanent cabin using black sand foundation from the beginning. They had spent their first winter in a crude shelter and were determined to build properly. Mikkel visited their site multiple times, advising on foundation depth, air gap construction, and floor joist placement. The Larsens built methodically, implementing every detail Mikkel recommended. By mid-June, all 3 projects were complete. The settlement now contained 4 cabins with black sand thermal systems. The visible impact was immediate. Dark perimeters marked these structures distinctly, creating an obvious visual signature that other settlers noticed and discussed. Summer brought unexpected challenges. The black sand, exposed to 20 hours of daily sunlight, absorbed enormous heat. Bjorn Svensson's cabin became uncomfortably warm, reaching interior temperatures above 70 degrees despite minimal fire use. He discovered that opening windows and doors for ventilation was necessary during the warmest weeks. This was a problem Mikkel had experienced and solved by simply accepting reduced interior temperature in summer, a minor inconvenience compared to winter benefits. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Trappers traveling through the region saw the black sand cabins and asked questions. Word reached the Russian-American Company Trading Post, where factor Dmitry Volkov discussed the innovation with visitors from other territories. By fall of 1850, variations of the black sand thermal foundation existed in at least 8 locations across northern Alaska and adjacent territories. The method evolved as others implemented it. Some builders used shallower sand layers to reduce hauling labor. Others experimented with different foundation designs, placing sand directly beneath floors without air gaps. Results varied based on implementation quality, but even crude versions provided measurable heating benefits. The core principle, dark surfaces absorb solar energy efficiently, remained valid regardless of specific construction details. Mikkel's innovation had transitioned from individual experiment to adopted community practice within 18 months of his cabin completion. Mikkel lived in his black sand cabin for 22 years. The structure required minimal maintenance, proving more durable than conventional construction. The volcanic sand foundation remained stable, never settling or shifting as organic soil would have. The cabin stayed warm each winter, allowing Mikkel to maintain comfortable conditions while consuming firewood at rates that gave him substantial safety margin against supply shortages. Ingrid grew up in the cabin, her childhood marked by reliable warmth that most frontier children never experienced. She learned to read using books Mikkel purchased during annual trips to the trading post. She helped with trapping during winter months and tended a small garden during brief summers. By age 16, she had become competent in all aspects of wilderness survival, capable and confident in ways that reflected her secure upbringing. In 1854, a missionary named Robert Hayes visited the settlement and documented what he called the sand-warming houses in letters to colleagues in more settled regions. His descriptions were among the first written records of Mikkel's technique. Hayes noted that families living in black sand cabins were healthier, better fed, and more prosperous than those in conventional structures. The reduced firewood requirement freed time and energy for other productive activities, creating measurable economic advantage. Mikkel never promoted his innovation actively. Visitors who asked questions received thorough explanations, but he made no effort to publicize the technique or claim credit for its development. His motivation had always been practical survival rather than recognition. The widespread adoption pleased him primarily because it meant fewer families would face the desperate cold that had killed Anna. In 1859, Ingrid married a trapper named Christian Olsen. They built their own cabin 7 miles east of Mikkel's location, naturally incorporating a black sand foundation. Christian had grown up in a conventional cabin and immediately appreciated the difference the thermal system made. He became an advocate for the technique among younger trappers entering the territory. Mikkel continued trapping until 1863, when declining physical capability made the work impractical. He was 58 years old, remarkably old for a man who had spent decades in the harsh Arctic. He attributed his longevity partly to never having suffered serious cold-related injury, unlike many trappers who lost fingers, toes, or suffered permanent damage from frostbite. The territory changed during these years. The Russian-American company's influence declined as Russian interest in Alaska waned. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska, bringing new administrative structures and increased American settlement. The fur trade that had sustained the region's economy collapsed as beaver and other fur-bearing animal populations declined, and fashion trends shifted away from fur. Many original settlers left during the 1860s. Lars Johansson moved to Oregon in 1864. Bjorn Svensson relocated to Sitka in 1866. Kari Anderson remained until 1868, then traveled to California. The settlement that had once contained 11 families shrank to 3 by 1870. Mikkel remained, living quietly in the cabin he had built 21 years earlier. Mikkel Strand died on March 14, 1871, 3 weeks before his 66th birthday. He had lived alone for the preceding 2 years after Ingrid and Christian moved south to Juneau, seeking better opportunities for their growing family. His death was peaceful, occurring during sleep on a cold but not extreme March night. Christian found his body during a planned visit 3 days later. They buried Mikkel on a hillside south of his cabin, overlooking the valley where he had trapped for more than 2 decades. Christian marked the grave with a wooden cross bearing Mikkel's name, birth year, and death year. No mention was made of black sand, thermal foundations, or innovation. To those who knew him, such additions would have seemed inappropriate. Mikkel had been a practical man who solved a problem. The solution spread was consequence, not goal. The cabin remained standing for decades. Christian maintained it for several years as a trapline shelter, visiting seasonally. When he stopped trapping in 1878, the cabin sat empty but intact. Later occupants included hunters, prospectors, and eventually homesteaders who found the structure and recognized its superior construction. The black sand foundation remained visible and functional into the early 20th century. By the 1890s, black sand thermal foundations had become relatively common across Alaska's interior and northern regions. The technique was known by various names: sand warming, black ground method, dark foundation system. Most users did not know who originated the approach. It had entered practical knowledge as anonymous folk engineering, passed between builders as established technique rather than recent innovation. Government surveys conducted after American acquisition documented unusual heating systems in northern cabins, but rarely attributed them to specific inventors. A report from 1883 noted that certain cabins in the Northern Territories employed darkened earth foundations that provide supplemental warmth through solar absorption, without mentioning Mikkel or the settlement where the technique developed. The physics Mikkel observed and applied were eventually formalized by scientists studying passive solar heating. By the mid-20th century, engineers understood thermal mass, albedo effects, and radiant heat transfer through mathematical models and controlled experiments. What Mikkel discovered through careful observation and logical reasoning became part of mainstream building science, applied in contexts far beyond Arctic cabins. Modern passive solar design incorporates principles identical to those Mikkel employed. Dark thermal mass positioned to absorb sunlight, insulated from exterior cold, radiating stored heat into living spaces. Contemporary builders use concrete, stone, or specialized materials, but the underlying concept remains unchanged. Absorb energy when available, store it efficiently, release it gradually when needed. Mikkel's legacy exists not in monuments or historical recognition, but in the continued use of principles he demonstrated. Frontier innovation operated this way, solving immediate problems through observation and experimentation, spreading through practical demonstration rather than formal documentation. The techniques that worked persisted and evolved. Those that failed were abandoned and forgotten. The black sand foundation succeeded because it addressed a genuine survival need, using locally available materials and simple construction methods.